Welcome to the MIT Open Documentary Lab and Co-Creation Studio's public lecture series. Today, it's really my sincere pleasure to introduce today's speaker, a colleague and a friend, Sarah Ellis, who's the Director of Digital Development at the Royal Shakespeare Company in the UK, although she's coming to us from Belfast, I hear today. My name is Kat Cizek, and I'm the Artistic Director of the Co-Creation Studio. Pronouns she, her, and as an audio description, I'm a white Gen X woman with brownish hair, and I'm wearing a big smile. Today, I'm in what is now called Toronto, Canada, situated on the treaty land and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit and traditional territories of the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe. This land is part of the territory protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. Claudia Romano, the producer of ODL, is going to post in the chat a longer bio for Sarah, who will be speaking for about 60 minutes, and then I'll be joined by panelists from our lab. Please do out there say hello, drop questions into the chat, and we'll get to as many of you as we can. But it really is my honor to let you know that Sarah Ellis is an award-winning producer and currently, as I said, the Director of the Digital Development for the Royal Shakespeare Company, the RSC. The latest partnership for the RSC is the Audience of the Future Live Performance Demonstrator, funded by Innovate UK. She's also been appointed chair of a digital agency, The Space, established by Arts Council England and the BBC to help promote digital engagement across the arts. She is one of those rare thinkers and doers who is equally comfortable in the boardroom, in the writer's room, on the stage, and figuring out programming for an LED wall. Today, Sarah's speaking about Dream, collective creation, audiences of the future, and pandemic pivoting. This is definitely going to be dramatic. I know it. We're thrilled to have you here, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Kat. And it's wonderful to be here. I use the pronouns she, her, and I'm a Gen X woman as well as Kat, with glasses, very badly dyed hair, hopefully a smiley face, and I'm sat in a hotel room in Belfast. It's an absolute privilege to be asked to share the next hour with you about the work that I do, but the work that many people do, and the work that I'm sharing today is represented by a huge range of brilliant thinkers, artists, researchers, technology companies. And at the heart of what we try and do at the RSC through the work that I do is work in collaboration, look at new models of making work, always work in partnership. And I've only found good come through those models. Those models often challenge traditional systems, but with people that are willing to take risk and to look at their practice in new ways. It's what we find not only in the middle, but on the edges. I was really lucky to be the project director of the Audience of the Future programme, exploring the future of live performance using immersive technologies, which is funded by the UK government, the UKRI, which is UK Research and Innovation. And it was brilliant to bring arts and culture into a space that it doesn't traditionally occupy in terms of the funding models. So one of the big things that we set out to do in this was to share our learnings and have that commitment across the consortium. The consortium that we brought together brought different arts organisations that explored performance in different ways, but had and maybe shared audiences, technology companies and research partners. And holding that and working with that community over the past few years has been an absolute privilege and has been challenging, but also at the most challenging of times has stepped up in ways that I have seen the best of people. And I think that that's something around the culture and the environments that you create around collaboration that's so important, about understanding people's differences and thinking about things from different perspectives. I'm going to talk you through that project today of what we did and get behind the scenes and go into quite a lot of detail around some of the things that our audiences won't have seen or experienced. And I'm going to share with you our work, and it, as I say, represents many people. And I'll talk you through the organisations, but also I'm going to share with you something that I haven't shared publicly before, which was a piece that we originally were going to make, and due to the pandemic was not able to happen. I'm going to share with you a small video with the early stage design of that. And so sharing with you now in Zoom and this hybrid day I have with an in-person sharing in Belfast, and then being with you virtually, is the world that we're in and the world that we're occupying. And I think the Audience for the Future, which started before the pandemic, had different perspectives and different measures of success. And to think about how you have to have a relationship with the world you're in, and when you're looking at research and development, where you start and where you end up can be very different. And working with people that are open to that and can work with that and find the learnings and sort of shift and pivot is super important. So Audience of the Future is a consortium around the live performance demonstrator of the Royal Shakespeare Company, the Philharmonia Orchestra, Manchester International Festival, Punch Drunk, and Marshmallow Laser Feast. Each creative company wanting to explore the future of live performance from their perspective, and each had a set of research and development questions that developed work. Each company owns its own IP for its work, and it allows us to make sure that all of us have ownership over our work, but we're really, really generous in how we share those learnings and how we're working together. And one of the deliverables of Audience of the Future is that we were also there to make a large-scale piece of work together that demonstrated a lot of the research and development over the few years that we committed to. And it also looked at how we could create an experience that reached over mass audiences of up to 100,000 people. So there were real targets and clear KPIs and what we had to achieve in this project. And so a lot of the decision making was around that. We also had 3 technology companies, which were Magic Leap, Epic Games, and Intel. And one of the things that we have looked at from a technology perspective is making work in game engine, looking at live and virtual worlds and real-time technologies, noting that live performance in its essence is about its real-time nature. So how do we use new and emergent real-time technologies and bring them into our traditional content making toolkits? And something that we hadn't done before in this way is work with academic partners. And this has been a real delight for us in the process around how we look at research and development, not having a relationship with the research either before or after, but a completely continuous relationship that builds over time and undulates into a dialogue between all the partners, and what questions that we're looking at, and how you look at the tension between how you look at a proposition academically, and then how you look at a proposition in terms of commercial or industry. And I think it's that convergence between industry and research, which is super interesting. And over the past few years, we've seen many projects happen that are looking at that convergence. And a real next step for us is, how do we create that into an ecosystem? How do we build the networks and communities that are required around that? How do we share that infrastructure? So it's not a binary research and industry, but now how do we look at diversity in terms of talent pools and pipelines? How do we look at diversity in terms of the content we're creating? And how do we look outside ourselves as a model that we feel is, we're changing those traditional systems? So what I'm going to do now is sort of bring you into the content and the world that has occupied my life over the past couple of years, and geekily show you some things that I hope you will find interesting too. When we started Audience of the Future, we were always going to look at the play, Shakespeare's play, Midsummer Night's Dream. It's one of those plays that you can test technology in and be magical. And it's a play that you think is about one thing, but it has multiple layers of experiences, whether it's the court of Theseus and the human world, whether it's the power dynamics between the 4 lovers, or whether you start and look at the mechanicals and the politics around that, or whether you embark in the fairy world. And often people look at that play and think, oh, the fairy world, isn't it lovely and wonderful and light and funny? but there's real darkness in the fairy world, and there's real jeopardy in the fairy world. In Shakespeare's time, the natural world was a real urgent place, and it's not that dissimilar to when we look at climate change now and the natural world we're in and the jeopardy that we have. If crops fail, then people wouldn't eat. And we have lots of documentation and storytelling of that time. If you went into the forest, those forests were scary places with no light, unknown things happening. And so in the play, the fairy world plays with world in flux. And effectively, what the fairy world is doing in that play is saying that the human world is not sitting right. And Puck is the character that broaches the fairy world and the human world and navigates both worlds and tries to, according to Oberon, who's effectively their boss, play mischief and also put things right. And it's in the spirit of that's how we explored the play of Dream, and thinking about the fairy world and thinking about how we played with something happening that disrupted our world. And we were going to do a performance in Stratford upon Avon in June 2020, I think. It's cat years now in terms of what year we're in. But and we were going into production, and we'd created this immersive performance in a department store in Stratford upon Avon using immersive technologies, whether that was projection mapping, real-time game engine technology, looking at headset technology, how audiences came into an immersed space that blended the real and virtual world in terms of the storytelling. We were looking at an event that happened and a whole world that you could, story world you could experience online before you experienced it. And then the pandemic hit, and we completely shut down and locked down. And in that moment, all we had left was the music. And I'm going to just show you now the fly through of the physical space that we would have performed in. First time I've ever shown it. And also talk you through just some of what you would have experienced had you been there in person. And also just recognize and take a beat for the creative team that got this far in a process and didn't make that show, and that how in those moments, I believe a lot of what those ideas are will come through in their work in many ways in the future, and how we navigate that. So bear with me while I share my screen. So there's no sound on this, so I'll talk over it. But we created this fictitious department store called Packworths, and a piece of moon rock shattered into it. And that was the disruptive moment in the theatre space. And this welcomed by people and could put your coats. And on the ground floor, it looked pretty much like a regular department store. Well, not so regular. It had items that maybe you wouldn't normally find in a department store. But you could see that there were televisions there and reporting back on the moon rock that just landed. All of this is inspired by Shakespeare's play. All of this is about new forms of storytelling, using those texts that have been adapted and reimagined over the past 400 years to find relevance and cultural connection between audiences and creatives. And as an audience, you will have been brought into this space. And then as you entered here, this would have been cut, and suddenly you would have entered a completely different reality. And this was all about navigating the fairy world and imagining the different scenes in the play in ways that you were participant and you were immersed with live actors performing around you, and how you played with the disruption of what Puck had caused the world and how we found a way through it. The creative team on this, Stephen Brimson Lewis who was our director of design at the Royal Shakespeare Company and designed The Tempest back in 2016, and has had a huge relationship with the RSC and theatre, reimagining this. We had a team from Magic Leap, Graham Devine, Andy Lanning, Sean Stewart, that were creating these story worlds with Alicia Lydecker. Some of those have gone on to create their own studios, making their work in similar ways to this, with the spirit of the innovation and the ideas that they brought to this. Many makers and practitioners engaged with this performance that I hope have gone on as well to take a lot of these ideas, these sketches forward, so that the work in some ways lives on. But this is what we were working to. And as I say, the pandemic hit, and just the Friday before we went into lockdown in the UK, we'd recorded the music. And through that, the first thing we had to do was make sure that the multiple partners in the consortium were okay. We had to make sure that we paid everyone, and we had to make sure that everyone was safe. And that's where we began. And as you can see, it gets more interactive as you get into the experience. And we were playing with the physical nature of interactivity and immersion. And I would argue that due to the consortium and the collaboration, this doesn't look typical of what you'd expect the RSC to do. And that was one of the things what we were experimenting with, as well as different audiences, different ways for audiences to connect with us. And again, the partners experiencing that on different floors, and that we could invite you here where you would have had an experience separate to, and taking certain audience members away from the experience. And it's in that spirit of R&D, and particularly with creative work, is that how much thinking and research goes into a final product, and how much work audiences won't see. But in this particular instance, this is something that they didn't see. So, still sharing? Let me just check. I'm now going to share the screen to show you what we ended up doing. So, the pandemic hit, and we had to completely rethink this work. And by doing that, the first thing that we did was we asked our audiences, and we worked with our research partners who were there to support us at this time, what were audiences craving? And in that moment, audiences told us they were craving togetherness, liveness, but there's a huge digital inequity in people's homes. And we needed to completely pivot this project from an in-person experience to an experience that was in people's homes, connected online. And we really needed to address the fact that we effectively had to make something that was equitable, and that affected all of the pivot and all the way that we were going to design this piece and approach it. So we worked with our research partners to imagine what we could do, keeping the spirit of real-time technology, keeping as much together as of the consortium and the partnership that we possibly could, ensuring that the relationship with the funder was going to work. And we radically shifted what we were going to do in a short space of time, because this project still needed to be delivered in a pandemic, and we were still in lockdown conditions. And what happened is we created Dream, inspired by Midsummer Night's Dream, and we created a live online performance set in a virtual forest. What I'm going to do now is show you a 5-minute clip of the performance that we actually made, and then after that I'm going to talk you through it. And within that you'll see a huge difference in creatively what it was, but I hope you will also see a shared vision and connections to a vision of that play, and how when you shift and pivot such a big piece and idea, how important it is to really have your audience at the heart of what you're trying to make and how you bring them with you. But also when we're looking at virtual audiences, all of the things we haven't yet built for our audiences to experience this work and what we need to make. So This is Dream.
Evening, everyone. We are going to take you out of your homes and into a forest tonight. It is beautiful and slightly unpredictable. And if we're going to catch it, we have to go now. It's dusk already and time moves fast. We only have until the sunrise. I'll be playing the character Puck, who is generally a bit of a troublemaker, but tonight should be a reasonably reliable guide. Fingers crossed. Follow me. All good, thanks. Okay, we're ready. Now, as soon as we get in there, you will see me become Puck. Wish me luck. Stay close to me, and if it gets too dark, light my way. Stay close.
Moon, take thy flight.
Who spoke?
The wood.
And sorry about that abrupt shift, but that gives you a sense of what effectively we transformed the brief into. We were using the same technology, we were looking at it from the sense of live performance, we were using immersive tech, we were exploring the future of audiences and their experiences. But as you can see, it was such a huge pivot and shift into make this work resonant and perform to an online audience wherever they were in the world in real time, and also in the conditions of lockdown that we were facing. You'll see here that this is a 7 meter by 7 meter volume, and it's a grid to pattern, and that was the volume that the actors worked in. But we actually made a 7 kilometer by 7 kilometer virtual forest in the Epic in the Unreal game engine, and the screen that you can see behind here is the world of the forest and what the audiences saw. And it was really important that the actors and the audiences had a connection and could see each other, and therefore it affected all of their performances and how they came together. And you'll see these dots, these yellow dots here, they're fireflies, and in key moments of the experience that we made, you were able to be a firefly and you were able to interact, and those lights lit up Puck's way in the forest. Now, it was a really interesting look at interactivity, because we understood that there was huge inequity in people's homes. So that meant that we also had to think about the technology that we presented this work on in people's homes. And that affects those layers of interactivity, and it affects the sort of connection and the ability to interact. And that if we made this for a VR headset, very few people would be able to see this work. So we made this work for desktop, tablet, and mobile. And we didn't just make it for the best, most cutting edge iPhone that you could possibly get. We were making this for like old devices, and that you could experience this passively and interactively. And I'll talk to you about later about how we onboarded audiences for that. But basically, there's huge complexity in making this work using real-time technology. But not only that, when you're streaming this work to audiences, you're also getting a feedback loop back. So we're not just distributing this work out, we're getting a reading back that is playing in. So again, you're playing with things that you would play in the real world or live audiences, and latency, how sound and visuals travel in this space. And all actors were using motion capture optical tracking. Each had a digital avatar that was differently designed according to their character and the world and the forest that Puck was inhabiting. And the premise that Puck had was that Puck had to find their way through the forest and make it till daybreak. So the jeopardy was that by lighting Puck's way as an audience member, you are helping Puck do their quest and find their way through. In this, we were using facial tracking, we were using something called Gesturement, and you will have seen in the performance that you just witnessed that when Puck moved their hands, that changed the sound of the music that was being performed. And that was a technology called Gesturement that we were using, that the Philharmonia were championing by an artist called Jesper Norden. And that was basically to look at how you embodied music in the performance, and how the actors not only were controlling their avatar and the speech, but they were also controlling the music around them through their bodies, and making this work as physically as we possibly could, even though it was virtual, and trying to find emotional connections using these technologies and avatars. And so that led us to lots of different ways to perform this big piece, and held together by a movement director. And actually what we keep coming back to is that the best storytelling technology there is the live actor. And it's out now in the future how that live actor holds an online or virtual audience alongside a live audience, and how over decades and years we have as performers changed our performance style according to the form that we're working in. So if we look at how we perform in our proscenium arched theatres, and how we project out as actors, and how we see our audiences and form those connections, levels of interactivity, cultural ways that we have stifled our audiences who can't cough or anything like that, as opposed to Shakespeare's day, where business was being done, people were letting the performers know whether they liked it, interacting. These are all performative elements that have not changed for us. And then if we look at broadcast, television and film, how the director has become much more intrinsic in the framing and the viewing of that, but also the performer has changed the way they perform. So less action out, input performances, much more emphasis on the facial expressions. And then when we look at these new technologies coming through, the facial tracking can't yet read a face in that photorealistic way that we might expect it to. So as a performer, how does a performer expand their facial expressions to get that meaning across? They're shifting the way they perform. And not only that, it's not a like for like experience. These experiences are about finding new ways to perform. And in that, an actor is responding to the tool that they have in order to get the emotion across. And so for all of this testing new technologies and expanding our horizons of immersive experiences, at the heart of these projects are always people and the performers and the human connection that we always crave in live performance, but the human connection that we crave as makers, whether we're a researcher, we work for a technology company, or whether we work for an arts organisation. And I think it's really relevant for us to look at, and I can't remember his name, we quoted this, but for the artists to become engineers and the engineers to become artists in this space, and look at the conversion and look at the meeting points. I think looking at the meeting points is such a profoundly important thing for us to do when we've been in a pandemic and we have lost those connections and we have lost those connection points, about how we find those pathways. This was the volume that we were working in lockdown. You'll see the safety across all of the computers. I was not allowed in this space until the final performance, and watching that live and the actors performing live made me realise we had 2 performances in one happening. And that's really important to think about as we move forward in a post-pandemic hybrid world. What do we take with us in terms of performance, and how do we take some of this learning when we were denied access into our spaces, how we've responded to that, and how we can think about new models coming forward, and what the proof of concepts have been over this time. So I sort of alluded to it before, but when we make a work in our spaces, and when I say our spaces, I mean the spaces that are occupied by companies that create work in them and invite audiences to come in. There are rituals and ways of working and models and infrastructures that bring audiences to them. There are press release announcements. We had our 2022 season announced today. There are, and that will have been shared with our audiences to welcome them back to the theatre, that we have marketing tools, we have infrastructures in our buildings where we welcome you, you put your coat in the cloakroom, you pick your ticket up, you go to the bar and get a really warm glass of dry white wine and a very noisy packet of peanuts. You come into the space, everyone brings their day in, everyone, if it's raining, everyone's got their coats on, it's a bit uncomfortable. In the UK, it's definitely raining. All of these things are cultural rituals that are part of what we do, of when we come into the performance. And then the mobile phone announcement comes on and then the lights go out. And we have these rituals, they're concentric circles to come in and bring these experiences together. And what we quickly realized in this performance was we had to make those rituals as well as making the experience. And my gosh, in a pivot of 4 months, we had to make an entire platform and a way to welcome audiences into that space. And we also needed to think about audiences not in location, but in their location, and globally program this work to be accessible to audiences around the world. And it's in the spirit of that that we then look at our audience now, in how, when we're making this work, and many people in our community are making this work, as artists, we are vulnerable in the sense that we are not just making our content, we are making our stages, we are making our infrastructure, we are making our distribution platforms, and we're making our content at the same time. And a lot of those distribution platforms are not yet thinking about homes as cultural spaces in the way that we might like to think about, and also the disruption around how it's not you coming to my world, it's me entering yours, and how that relationship and engagement and contract is very different. So we wanted to make a piece of work that was accessible and global, and we found that 59% of audiences looked at it on a mobile, We also saw that on desktops, actually people enjoyed watching it on television. And we also, we created a piece of work that I'm delighted to say reached 92 countries in performance. Over 10 performances, we had 65,000 people attend those performances from around those 92 countries. And of those 65,000 audience members, 40% of those were Generation Y and Z. And if we think about that, if you look at, if you reflect back on the content I showed you, because that content was made with a language and a visual image for audiences that are emergent, that are coming through from for our future and our future relevance, we were bringing together intergenerationally our traditional audiences and this future audience, and convergence really was interesting around interactivity and how younger audiences absolutely lapped up the interactivity, and the explanation for interactivity in our traditional audiences needed some more care and attention. So not only did we need to think about that, we needed to reevaluate what meaningful immersive meant virtually for us and how we looked at it from an audience perspective. And again, by working with our research organisations, we were able to have a conversation that was in the middle rather than a creatively led direction that then we had to respond to, and audiences had to shoehorn their way in. And I think one of the things about emerging technology is that now we are able, in those moments of emergence, to be able to put the audience at the heart of the experience and think about how we make work for them, with them, without the cultural biases and traditional biases that we've experienced, and how we challenge ourselves. And that's not an easy connection to have. So we were really looking at what would motivate audiences to come see us, and how we segmented those audiences, and how we might have changed our messaging according to those audiences. We also looked at access as well, and it's not just technology in terms of the device. It's about how many people have good internet connection, how many people are sharing devices. These are things that are silent in our work, and also it's sort of one of the dangers that we get into around how we're at the front of something, but we create a new privilege. We think we're going against a tradition, but actually we're reinventing a privilege, and how we need to hold on to that and think about that. And also, what did audiences need in that experience? What could they or couldn't they do? And when we look at the sense of togetherness, that affected having a narrative that everyone was experiencing at the same time together, and keeping that on rails, and making sure that we were really conscious of the audience move in lockdown, and how anxiety, stress and fear and anger might be challenging, and we may not be able to read that and see that in the experience that we were making. So it was all those sorts of things that we were thinking about. I'm just going to change my slide. So meaningful as well means different things if you're a technology company or if you're a creative organisation. And one of the massive things I've learned is don't assume when you say a sentence that it's understood in how you have presented it, particularly when you're looking at engineers and artists and how we describe it. So we had to look at what meaningful meant and understand that and be all on the same page. And we also had to think about an experience that was meaningful, that maybe, yes, you'd sit and watch a 3-hour performance of a Shakespeare play in real life, in the conditions that we have set up for you in that way. But in the online space, that might change. And so we looked at an experience that was 20 minutes, but it was an experience that felt about an hour, where we brought you in and we had a pre-part and the show and then an after part. These were all really important things that we had to respond to and think about really quickly in the pivot. But also, because we had 18 months of connection on this collaboration consortium, we had all of that infrastructure and understanding and respect that's required to take those big risks and connections. So again, immersive is such a widely used word, and in some sense is problematic. We've always been immersive. I believe that theatre's always been a form of virtual reality. So it's the reappropriation of these words and how do they fit into a contemporary landscape. Immersive for us was, we were making this with virtual production tools, And we had to make this with virtual production tools because we couldn't be together in person. We had to look at the mocap distribution. We had to think about the audio and visual coming together. And again, we had to completely make sure that when we were saying the word immersive, that it had a resonance and people understood what we meant around that. So with that, by geeking out and going into quite a lot of detail, we had to get those working definitions of immersive really clear to make sure that we were really on the same page and we were really engaging with each other in the way that for this particular performance we felt about it, but also recognizing there are lots of different forms of immersion. And also we had to think about our audience experience timeline differently. How are we going to bring people into the space? And one of the things we didn't want is for this performance, for you to be taught how to use the performance while you were in the performance and affect your enjoyment of it, and also affect how you felt in the performance. And what I mean is, we don't want you to make you feel stupid, like you don't know anything. There are cultural assumptions around Shakespeare and the intellectual debate in connection with that. There are so many things that can make you feel uncomfortable. And again, we couldn't address it because we couldn't see you unless you shared it on social media or connected with us in the ways that we'd set up. So we put quite a lot of consideration into the onboarding, where we tested your technology when you bought a ticket. So if the interactive version didn't work, we always gave you a passive version. So it always meant you had an experience that you knew would work and had been tested in advance. We knew that a lot of the problems with online work or virtual connections is that the technology at home doesn't work, or it needs an adaptation, and the show's over by the time you fixed it, ruining your experience. So all of that played in. We needed to make sure that you knew how the interaction worked and were comfortable with that. And also, we often forget as well, is how do we leave you? How do you walk away from this? How do you move on after having this experience? And in the real world, if you go to the theatre, you're back in the bar. And at that point, the actors are with you and you can have a chat. So we did Q&As at the end where you had the actors sit around, invited guests to talk about the experience, answer questions, and just share some of the work and some of the behind the scenes nature of it. So we had to create a website for you to come to. We had to create a world. We had to create a virtual space. It was effectively functioning as a building. Didn't look like a building. It was a website, but it had things on it that just allowed you to feel comfortable as you're coming in, the equivalent of taking your coat off, the equivalent of you experiencing this and doing all the things that you might need to do before the experience. And in that, we had to do some very quick user testing of this site to make sure that what we wanted you to do was being understood, and also get a feedback loop on what audiences wanted to know before the experience. So the key timeline on this was really, really tight, and I can honestly say in the pandemic, absolutely challenging. And it took a lot of different groups and a lot of different structures, structures that we didn't ordinarily work with, and layers of organizational structures and team structures that were different to how we ordinarily did things. And that challenged the consortium. Not everyone works in the same timeline. Something that's short term is very, difficult if you're dealing with large scale work and work that needs time and a build time that we just didn't have. So all of those were challenges within this, and yet all the time we were thinking about our audiences and the content that we created. So the audience journey had a pre-event, a live event, and a post-event, and we mapped that out alongside, synchronistic to the work being made. But a lot of the people making this audience journey didn't quite know how the creative was landing. We were constantly second guessing at points about how this would work. And then we had to look at our UX flows and make sure that the different audiences, the interactive audiences and the passive audiences, had the right information and how they were going to work. And again, all of this takes a care and consideration, and everyone's working towards that moment of togetherness and liveness. And we found that the questions as well were different to what we'd ordinarily connect with. Even on a streamed event, because we were asking people to be interactive, because it was slightly different, because it would look different, we were looking at digital avatars, we weren't looking at people's faces in the same way. It was all connected to that we were looking at our audience questions up front and working with our audiences throughout to do that. So we created a customer care plan that had a live chat and just that one-to-one experience of the onboarding, but also within the performance too. And I'm really proud to say that with the streaming infrastructure that we had, a show never went down. It was always robust on the show's delivery. And that jeopardy and that breaking of that contract was a real thing for us in a priority of how we ensured that worked. And by dealing with much of the audience questioning in advance, we were able to really make that happen and support that. And another thing that came up in this project, which I think more so than had we not pivoted, was accessibility. And particularly when we're looking at the future of live performance and we're looking at these new technologies, can we take a moment and a beat to reflect on maybe the traditional and pathways to experiences that kind of are barriers, and we've stopped thinking about them as barriers, but we think about them that they're just the perceived pathways for experiencing our work. And Joe Verrant from Unlimited did this amazing workshop with us to highlight how we could think differently about that in our design. And I think that's something that we tried to land and did a good job on, but I think there's so much more to do in this area. How do we look at these technologies from a non-ableist approach? How does motion capture become not a like-for-like form of puppetry, but a form of using the mobility that's available or you have and transforming that into some form of superpower? Why is it that a sign language interpreter is sat on a little screen at the edge of the experience? Why is this not integrated? Why aren't we using things like motion capture as a form of sign language? How can the audio description be an integral part? Why is it that accessibility is just thought about as you having an impairment, and actually accessibility is about accessibility, access to all, democratization? And I think that it's in this pivot that this has really come out as something that also we need to revisit around the technologists we work with, the designers that we work with, the stories we're telling. And it's a huge opportunity for us to rethink when we're looking at rethinking systems and hierarchies and cultural assumptions, that we don't make diversity or accessibility a strategy, but we make those elements a reality. And what we need to do that to do that and achieve that is challenging and will take profound change in many of the things that we do and look at. So that the website here was something that we put out into the world, and I can honestly say, do not use, if you want to keep your sanity in a project, don't do a clicker that tells you how many days are left to your first performance, because yes, for an audience that's amazing. As a producer, that made me feel physically sick at times. I'm joking, but the point is that people had that anticipation of the event, and that's what we were working to, that you were counting down to this performance, you knew when it was happening, and that you were able to start thinking about it. And this is the bit that I'm just sort of alluding to on the accessibility, is that we did look at accessible features. We looked at a sonic story that you could read sonically before the experience. We had so forms of visual storytelling, forms of audio storytelling, captioning. But I would have loved, had we had time, to make this much more integrated, and that it's not an access page, but these are part of the experience and how we move that forward, or how we make those decisions, how we make those choices and make that clear. Audience responses were super interesting. We had such a wide range of people. You'll see social media pictures of people, kids in school, someone having an ice cream, someone here at the bottom telling us that there's 5,132 audience attenders. For all the bleeding edge technology that was in this piece, some of the most unexpected joyful moments were the easiest forms of technology. Audiences were sharing their anticipation to the event, checking in about an hour before, really excited, sharing on social media, and getting so excited that they were part of 5,000 people watching this show in real time together from their homes, looking at togetherness in that way, looking at liveness in that way, and also knowing we were connecting with 5,000 people accessibly and connectedly were real things that were the joyful moments that you just don't know until you get that audience there, that they're going to receive it in that way and they feel comfortable. And one of the learnings and things to think about here is that we're still in broadcast models where we're broadcasting our content out and giving permission for audiences to connect around our social media feeds. But what happens if in the future that we get that individual person that comes to the theatre on their own, but has those chats with those people in the auditorium just serendipitously and connectedly, and has those connection points? And how can we create structures and systems where audiences can rock up and have a nice chat? Those technologies are there, and how do we start putting them in the design of the work that we're doing? So the thing about the takeaway for me is definitely homes as cultural spaces, particularly post-pandemic, how they are much more defined, how we are immersed in our homes, how we are making our homes event spaces that are places of connection, places that we've had to connect with the world, whether that's doing our online shopping to whether that's connecting with a live performance. These are all cultural shifts that we are embarking on, and truly exciting, but we are coming into people's homes now. So we need to be welcomed, and we need to make sure that how we're coming into those homes is respectful. And also we need to be thinking about how we create that dialogue and connection with audiences. So many people were setting up their homes and taking pictures, not just of the performance, but their world building of what they were experiencing. And because we were doing a collaboration, the connection and the press coverage allowed us to be way more diverse, fit in areas of the press community that we never usually would get to as singular organisations, and expand that range. And I believe reach those audiences and those statistics that I mentioned earlier. And I think that we did a media report on the project, and I'm really delighted to say that we got equal coverage for each partner. So it wasn't the RSC's brand that was driving it. We were getting equal coverage, equal representation, and using the strengths of all the different companies that we were working with in order to get that conversation going in the press. And that gave us a huge amount of connection to audiences that we wouldn't ordinarily connect with, but also highlighting this work in a mainstream environment, not looking at immersive technology as niche and available on a particular circuit of industry, but thinking about mainstream audiences that sometimes we underestimate our audiences, who take risk, who are bold, who like exciting things, who can really go there, that don't always need to be sanitized and receive the same content. If we're looking at new audiences, let's make new work, new content for new audiences, rather than marketing something differently using traditional forms of content. Let's think about that and see what shift we get. Let's see what feedback we get from our audiences. And let's think about, again, those meeting points between generations, and the generation who live pre-internet have grown up without an internet, but live in an internet world. And those audiences that are young, who have grown up with nothing but the internet. So these social campaigns and the work we did here, hugely important.
Follow me.
And finally, I'm just going to leave you with the onboarding of this project, the lobby we made that we'd never expected to make, that we never imagined we'd need to make, and how that UX brought you into the world of the play. And so we weren't just sharing a YouTube link, but we were giving you a way into this experience, looking at the new rituals around culture, looking at how we could take you into the world. of the play and give you an experience that would allow us to come together.
How to interact. With your fellow audience plus ticket holders, you influence the virtual world in which the actors perform. Here's a quick guide to how to use the interactive player. At the start of the performance, you'll see this screen. Click Enter. When the screen splits, it's time to interact. Use this tool to choose where you'd like to send the firefly. Drag it like this, release it, and see it enter the virtual world. Controls for your experience are at the bottom of the screen. Use this slider to control the volume. Make sure the volume on your device is turned on and turned up. Click here to turn captions on or off. Enter full screen like this, and exit like this. That's all you need to know. Enjoy your dream.
Thank you. I think I'll leave it there, but as we look at the audience of the future, I think it's really appropriate to end with how we hold our audiences in those spaces and prepare for these experiences. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for bringing us into the world of this incredible production, this incredible play, and above all, the story and the meaning that comes out of all the work that you did, and the story behind the scenes. As I'm just going to welcome all our panelists from the lab and open this up for questions in our audiences of the present. But I'm also, I just want to mention that my daughter, my kid, 8 years old, totally got this, was hooked right from the beginning. And at the end, there was a silence and she just said, so the dawn must rise. And yeah, she was in there with you. So I'm just going to invite panelists. Are there questions from our group? Oh yes, William.
So you can hear me, I take it, yeah? Sarah, first of all, just a huge thanks from the depths of history. And I say this as someone who's really spent a lot of time looking in particular at the relationship between Shakespeare and emergent media forms. I have a book from 100 years ago that has a huge chunk on early film, together with Roberta Pearson, who you may know, looking at sort of how that medium, took Shakespeare and kind of showed what it could do. But even before that early cinema moment, there's actually a lot of, someone like Albert Robida sort of anticipates what TV might do with it. We're talking 1883, 1884. So before TV as we know it, but the idea was there. And so I mentioned these two examples because they go to your point about ritual. And I want to get that's what I'm going to ask about, in fact, ritual. For Robida, when he imagines doing theater on the television screen, For him, it's all about not having to go to the theater, not having to wear a coat, not having to get wet, not having to walk through a crowd of people, not having to strain your neck and look around out of your box. For him, it's about the play in your bedroom, period. No ritual. Cinema comes and replicates precisely the curtains and the box office and it's interestingly, it is 15 to 20 minute Shakespeare's that predominate until about 1909 or 1910. And there's a hell of a lot of them. But anyway, my question to you is, so what about ritual in this? Where do you see that going? Are we still in a space, audience comments, waiting for our seats, waiting in the lobby? Of course, people are going to frame this with what they know, but what's your sense? What's your sense of the ritual that will accompany this set of media technologies? Thanks.
I think that's a really interesting question, because we put those rituals in because they're forms of benchmarks and signifiers for audiences that we're bringing with us. And we were bringing a traditional audience with us into a new space, and those cultural reference points were incredibly useful and important. What's really interesting is this generation coming through, which is so delightful and wonderful. And, you know, Kat's daughter and my son are audiences that are in it and aren't needing those cultural reference points or explanation, because it's how they live their life. And I can give you very sort of reductive examples of, like, my son being in Minecraft and seeing that as a social space and a creative space and a building space on a device, and also watching videos on YouTube of others doing that. So as a person who's interested, and then playing those out in the playground in real world ways with his peers. We are in a generation of makers. We are in a future creator economy. And one of the biggest challenges for institutions is its relevance and how it disrupts those spaces. And if we look at Instagram as a form of reading, if we look at those spaces, they aren't really needing those rituals in the same way. But we have this traditional, as I say, it's the connection between the audience who are pre-internet and the people that are of the internet. And I do think that the cultural reference points of the rituals that we speak of now are forms of meeting point for us to get to a place of connection that allow us to go further with the work. So it's about that construct at the moment, but how that develops and evolves will be super interesting, and how much we need of that. But again, it's that constant question that you have in the back of your mind is, am I creating a new cultural bias? Am I creating a new form of tradition? Do you know what I mean? And I think that's about the diversity of work we make. And at this time, all the levels of experimentation. And we're in this liminal space where I believe we're looking for the answer, but actually, let's not look for the answer. Let's look for the multiple ways that we can explore it, because effectively the answer will homogenize. And that's, we're in this liminal space. And I honestly, when we're thinking about the work that comes after this, the work that comes after the pandemic, I'm really struggling to place the technology with that at the moment. I'm really struggling to think about those constructs. Yeah, I can say to you, I want to move people. I want to make people feel scared. And how do I do that? I can talk about those things, but how we look at the models is really challenging. So again, the rituals become a form of cultural reference point that is helpful to us.
Sarah. Hi. Thank you so much for this amazing presentation, and also for this work and all the things you're thinking about. It just is really exciting. I saw a dream in my living room and was really moved by it. And my question is also around this idea of audience togetherness that you talked about, when most of the audience is passive. And you've set up this way for people to come into the show and interact, and that wonderful moment where you put all the photos, you showed all the photos and reactions. I'm curious about the post performance, and whether you thought about bringing out more interaction then with, you know, the audience that is just sitting in their home. And also, you know, when I think about that idea of what you bring forward and what new rituals you create or new actions, I was thinking too about after you leave a play, you go with whoever you went and you know, go to a cafe or a meal and you chat about it. That post-theater moment is really wonderful too. And what would that look like perhaps with the same people that you came with who aren't in the same room, or people that you don't know, and whether you've thought at all about that the post experience, and
Not enough
programming it.
Not enough yet, but those are brilliant points that we should be thinking about, to say that, Sarah. Yeah, I think that post is really interesting, particularly around, say, this emergent generation that are coming through, because they're world building. So it doesn't necessarily stop once the storytelling is not happening. If we think about persistent narrative, if we think about narrative that we can return to, that exists, those are the worlds that are being made. And again, when you look at pre, during and after, that's a linear form of storytelling, isn't it? That's on rails, and we know that that's for me a big convergence piece. And I'm really interested to see when dream becomes really old and antiquated. So people going, oh yeah, but we don't do that anymore because we're just in this world, and we touch in and touch out, if you know what I mean. And that's, I think, Sarah, I think that's for the post, that's interesting around the post. When we have had an experience that we've had together in real time, we've experienced it, we have been transformed, because that's what you want when you're in theatre, a form of transformation. And what that feels like afterwards is a really interesting question. You guys should rock that one out and count me in.
Yeah, let's rock that one. Tamara.
Thank you so much for the great presentation. It was super interesting. My question kind of relates to what Sarah was asking. I was wondering if you had explored kind of having these type of performances in the like a metaverse space, now that there's so many different organizations that are looking into creating different spaces. And my other question kind of relates to that as well, was in terms of like scalability, if that played any role in terms of access, when you were talking about like making the work accessible, and it's like bringing traditional people who go see these plays, but how do you expand your audience, and how did that play into the design?
Wow, big stuff there, thank you. Yes, I would love a metaverse. I think it's delightful and wonderful and brilliant, and you know, Shakespeare metaverse, I've mentioned that in many internal meetings, to many questions as well. Metaverse obviously playing on Shakespeare text, so not always understood in the same way. I think it's a really relevant question. I'm really curious around metaverse ideas, and because we're seeing a lot of that in the media right now, and we're seeing a lot of perceptions around what metaverse is. And it does strike me that we want to build a metaverse, but we haven't gone, well, what metaverse would we want to live in? Or do you know what I mean? With the step back questions, we're just going to do it, and then there you go. So I think where arts and culture sits brilliantly around that question around metaverse is what world are we, what does this mean, and what world are we occupying, and how we live in that and with that. So it's a bit challenging when you're thinking from an arts organisation perspective, because effectively you make the metaverse that's relevant to you, if that makes any sense. And actually there's a broader question here, and can we get cultural practitioners and disruptors and thinkers to pull that together? And I think that, again, it goes back to the systemic change of, we have like a singular artistic vision when we have arts organisations, we have a singular building structure, and that's what we do. Whereas actually in the metaverse, this is about ecosystems, this is about networks, this is about different structures. And the collaboration model and the co-creation model then lends itself to that. This is a very wordy answer to you, Tamara, and I'm really sorry if I've gone off piste. But the answer is, yes, it would be amazing to look at that. There are some quite big barriers for us to explore that in a way that I think is genuinely new and interesting. And I think that's for me, what do we mean by metaverse for our world building as arts organisations? Because a Shakespeare metaverse would be lovely, but who that's for has to be really thought about.
We have a question from Malaysia before we go to Joanna. Is there a 6 DOF version of this performance shown at immersive film festivals worldwide? Have you transposed or adapted this work?
That would be so lovely. We ran out of time, money. That would be a delightful thing. We could do that, but that's a big lift for us in order to do that. But maybe would be my question. It would be nice. And one of the things we would have loved to have done is stream it real time to VR headsets, but there are so many technical challenges. That is a whole nother presentation, but yeah, we would have loved to.
Joanna?
Bye, Sarah. Thank you for your presentation. It's amazing work, and I really appreciated the time that the project gave to thinking about access in terms of BSL and audio description. And I just wondered if you can share sort of any audience feedback that you had from that, or any sort of big challenges or surprises that came out of doing that work.
Yeah, I think it was really interesting that a lot of our traditional audiences wanted the audio description because we didn't play with text in a conventional Shakespeare way. It was quite embodied narrative, and so there was little text, and I think that worked for audiences globally. So it was connecting because it didn't have a barrier around language, but there were those audiences that really engaged with the audio description. And it was kind of like also for audiences that hadn't experienced this work before, coming from a different place, it actually was like your sort of documentary style, this is what's happening. And also the audio description was quite dramatic, like the performer of the audio description was really enigmatic, that it placed another level of drama into the experience. So those are the sorts of responses we got, but I don't think we went far enough. I'll be very frank there. I think we did some great tools around access and inclusion that should be done, but we could have gone further. We could have integrated more had we had more time and thought about that. And I think that that's a really important, also just the sort of approach around, you know, the design of that needs more care and attention from the beginning.
Thank you.
I was really struck by learning how integrated the academic research was about audiences, and how you integrated that very much into your working process. Can you speak a bit more to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite funny. I'm at a conference today with a load of academics, and I said in a sort of roundtable session, I love academics, really unfilteredly, and they all laughed. But I love academics because they come at a question completely differently or in the same way. But we needed to ask some quite fundamental questions before we made this work, and I felt that it was a huge disservice and cultural assumption of us to make work without doing a level of audience research. And in some ways you stop, when you look at industry, sometimes it stops asking the audience questions that audiences are motivated by. We don't even ask that often if people liked it. We just ask you, did you see it? Rate it 1 to 5. What was your experience like? But it's sort of like an academic focus asks that question from a different lens, and it has a level, I believe, of agnosticness and rigor that allows me to work with a question where I can place it in the middle and have a conversation with creatives around that. And I think that as we've got to be really mindful of just not transferring a set of creative practice expertise into a new framework without genuinely challenging what that means from an audience research perspective. And I think an academic rigor around that's absolutely vital. And I think if we look at Shakespeare for now, Shakespeare in the future, or any cultural content, you also can't commercially justify it either. We can't close our stage for 8 days of filming because we think that audiences will like what we make. We have to commercially know that we have a demand for that from our audiences as well. There's just those, it's just that sort of thinking. So for me, it's an opportunity. And also in terms of the academic relationship, often you'll get asked in a project, why didn't you do that? Or why didn't you think that? Retrospectively from an academic, and you're like, I never even thought about those things. That's not what I do. So the closer I can get to have that relationship, we can sometimes ask those questions much more synchronistically. And I don't think that research happens at the beginning and at the end. I think that it's a evolving conversation.
And there was a particular moment too, from what I understand, that the academic researchers were also just observing the transformative landscape of the pandemic pivot for audiences and looking at what was going on online, which I found fascinating. They were able to feed that to you through an academic lens, scholarly lens. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, they totally geeked out on it. They totally, like, the level of data that was coming back from audiences about how they were experiencing it, what the commercial price points were, so what the willingness to pay was in the experience, what device worked best for them, what barriers to entry were there, what worked for them narratively, what didn't work for them creatively. You know, these are questions we do not ask our audiences, so for them to have that data and research to quantify that was really, really helpful. And I think, again, as a researcher, you don't come with, let's place it, a sensitivity that we might have as practitioners around those answers that you might get, but help make it in the future. So yeah, there was a huge amount of data and evidence coming in, both from audiences through surveys and questionnaires and qualitative, as well as the data of audience reach.
There's a question from Robert Jarrett in our audiences, and I think your showing of the lobby explains some of this, but maybe you can be a little bit more precise for us. Can you explain how the audience was intended to experience the performance when it had been intended as an in-person event? They're talking about control in the space, I think. Did they move through the virtual space you showed at the beginning on their feet using a controller? Was it controlled by you, the presenters? Can you explain a little bit control?
Sure. So that was the really difficult part, is that we couldn't get that level of immersion in the experience without compromising the accessibility. So we compromised the interactivity in order to ensure that it was accessible to audiences. And I believe that was the right decision for the time. And also, I believe that that brought a mainstream audience that would never have access to those interactive technologies and find an audience for it and build those bridges around that and create a demand. So that would have been a lovely thing to do. And I would have loved it if you had controllers and you were there as a firefly, but actually you were using your mouse mat, or you were using your finger on your iPhone, and you were basically using it to fling these fireflies into the experience. And I'll give you a very amusing anecdote of how different generations dealt with that. So my son, when the interactivity thing came up, he went to the desktop and the computer and was on the mouse mat and very comfortably put many fireflies into the world, the panorama that he saw, and lit Puck's way. And my dad, who plays golf, gave it a go and thought he killed Puck because he hit Puck because he's a really good shot. So those are the different cultural pathways when we look at interactivity. And my dad was genuinely quite stressed for a couple of minutes in the experience, but there you go.
You didn't use or test enough with golfers, clearly.
Yeah, clearly, and he was really good at it. Yeah.
Shireen.
Thank you, Sarah. It's so inspiring. Really great to hear your thoughts.
We're not hearing you. Sorry.
You can't hear me?
Do you want to chat? Drop it in the chat and we'll read it out loud. And meanwhile, we'll go to Sarah. But Sarah, we can't hear you either. You have to unmute.
No, I'm not supposed to unmute. Can I talk? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Another question I had, you said that now you're going into people's homes, right? So you're breaking the physical place that you are. You're changing that. has that at all led you to thinking about other places you might go beyond the physical theater besides the home, whether it's into public spaces or other areas once you've kind of break out of the theater?
Oh,
Or
absolutely.
you might use like augmented
I
reality.
think it goes back to Tamara's. Yeah, it goes back to Tamara's point about the metaverse, and I think that's how, you know, it's where we can coexist and where we can have presence and where we can look at performance in all of the stages that we can occupy. And I think that's the exciting part of it more generally, is that, you know, these are storytelling devices, these are stages, we're here on a stage together. These are all of the places for story to exist. And I think that what I'm really interested in is, you know, really confronting the popularism that is on a lot of these stages. And usually, you know, traditional forms have been disrupted, but now we are disrupting those spaces. And how do we provide content that's transformational, meaningful in those forms of disruption? And that's a big question, I think, for us going forward, is that how do we, and that's what I meant about going into spaces and cultural spaces that aren't owned by us and controlled. And you hear a lot at the moment around control. I have this platform, I've made this platform, I can control it. Yet who's going to see it? And it is that navigation at the moment between control and being on platforms that you can't, or stages that you can't, in spaces that you can't, and how do we navigate that? Again, it goes back to the metaverse. These are really challenging questions for us to think about how we position our work.
And it goes back also to the fly through that you showed of the original idea of being in this department store and trying to bridge those worlds again, from the living room to the shopping mall. I think it ties to Shireen's question. I wondered if there are lessons from the online accessibility and audience research that you were doing to bring this back into the in-person performances. Are you exploring hybrid performances with live and online audiences together?
Yeah, I mean, hybrid is where it's at, but we get like real pushback from people going, well, I just want to be in the theatre without anything, you know. There are real sort of cultural resonances around what people see as theatre as and where they want to go with that. But in terms of accessibility, yes, I think that we've had to really rethink our welcome to our audiences in forms of health and safety as well. You know, we have to think about consent. We do think about consent. We do think about how comfortable you are. We do think about how safe you feel in these spaces. And that will bring up layers of inclusion and accessibility. But we have had audiences that have said, look, it's really hard for me to get to the theatre, and that actually connecting with you via Zoom or a way that I can be in my home and be co-present with you allows me to feel much more comfortable, and actually your spaces aren't easy for me to navigate. And so actually what it's more really done is create a conversation around how people feel, how they feel comfortable. And again, that's a broader issue, and that's not necessarily related to what I would call an obvious disability, which is what accessibility is traditionally approached, but actually looking at inclusion and what that means for people is really important.
And centering the accessibility as a creative potential,
and
rather
also
than add-on.
Absolutely, and how we build towards an inclusive recovery, and also that as we come out of the pandemic, it is not inclusive. We are privileged to be able to be I'm privileged to be able to travel and be in Belfast. That's not the case for everybody. That we have, and also this work has been happening for years but hasn't had a mainstream voice, and now we've looked at accessibility from a completely, you know, where people have empathized with the feeling of not being able to do something. It's part of our conversation, but we have a responsibility to land that, and people have worked in this space for decades, long time, that know that have amazingly imaginative approaches that need a voice.
We have time for one more question from Cindy.
Hi, more of a, I guess, a comment and kind of a dream about the dreaming. If I think about Sleep No More, you're familiar with that, and I think about Tracy Fullerton's Walden and how you were able to wander and find. I think that in some ways it's kind of like a build it, they will come. If you had the money, like if you had the resources, that this is a world where people want to be and they want to explore. And how much do you have to curate that experience if you build a space that they can walk through, where they can dream and they can be a firefly or follow fireflies? Like, what is it more about like a web VR immersion kind of experience where they can come together? And in the way that Sleep No More would be is I could be in one of those forests and the actors may show up or they may not, but I can be there.
Yeah, but that's like the metaverse, isn't it? It's like, yes, you could do those things. We can create the worlds, and then, I mean, Fortnite's like that, or have an event and then it won't. And that's the bit where we're really I personally am really interested in that, because you know that you have a level of persistence there, and you have a level of world building there, not a proscenium stage and all of that. And I totally get that. I think for Dream, we would have loved to have explored those things, but the time that we had to make it, and the fact that it was just practical. But I think also we wanted to bring people around a journey and a story that brought us together in that moment. And I think that the agency that you had to be individual for us in the terms of the mood that people were in, actually in that moment, we made an artistic decision for everyone to come together to help Puck make it through the storm. And I think, but I think that everything that you've talked about there, awesome, bring it on, that would be great to do. Very expensive, but very great.
That's all the time we've got, but I want to really thank you, Sarah, for pulling back the curtains on the curtains and exposing and giving us a window onto this incredibly co-creative process that you were a part of, and for showing us that it's not about consensus. It really was about a lot of loss and grief, and having to really figure out. It's like being in a car, on a car trip, and with all the different generations, and trying to figure out the thing that everybody's gonna be happy with in the end. And I think you really did that. Thank you so much to our panelists and for everybody out there. And please join us next week for a talk by John Craig Freeman, artist and professor of art and technology at Emerson College. Thank you for being with us.